Okay, so in part 2 of our Chapter 8 introductory video series on the nervous system, we're going to be getting into the structure and function of neurons. But before I get into that, I wanted to add something on to the previous video. I talked a little bit about the afferent and efferent divisions of the peripheral nervous system, and these two terms can be kind of frustrating, can be kind of difficult to differentiate from one another. But the mnemonic device that I usually use to differentiate the two terms is to associate the word afferent with the word arrive and the word efferent with the word exit. So things in an afferent system are going to be arriving to a central point. So in this case, it would be the central nervous system. Signals are going to arrive to the central nervous system from the peripheral nervous system. So in an efferent system, things like motor commands will be leaving the central nervous system or exiting the central nervous system to move out to the peripheral nerves. So in the next two videos, we're going to be covering Learning Target 2, which is going to involve distinguishing between neurons and neuroglia on the basis of their structure and function, distinguishing different types of neurons from one another and different types of neuroglia from one another. So in this first video, we're going to be just talking about neurons, and if you are looking at a neuron, you're going to see a few of the following things. First, you'll see a cell body or a soma, and then several branches off of that body, right in here, called dendrites, an axon to carry signals from the cell body, and then one or more synaptic terminals where the communication happens. And these synaptic terminals we did talk about a little bit as those neuromuscular junctions in the muscular system. So within the body of a neuron, you're going to find many mitochondria to produce lots of ATP, rough endoplasmic reticulum, and free ribosomes, which when clustered are called Nissl bodies. And those Nissl bodies give a gray tint to areas containing many neuron cell bodies, and that leads to the gray matter that you usually hear about when talking about nervous tissue. Most neurons also lack centrioles, so if you can consider what the role of a centriole is in a cell typically, you can start considering what neurons are unable to do as a result. So outside the body of a neuron, you'll find that dendrites are sensitive to chemical, mechanical, or electrical stimulation, which leads to generation of an action potential, which, as you know, travels down the axon to the axon terminals to send signals to effectors. So now we're going to be getting into the three structural classifications of neurons. The first of these three structural classifications of neurons is multipolar neurons. These multipolar neurons can be found with two or more dendrites and a single axon. These neurons are the most common because all skeletal muscles are controlled by this particular type of neuron. The second type is the bipolar neuron. They have two processes, one dendrite and one axon with a body in between. So you can see the body in between here. These are fairly rare. They occur only in the special sensory organs, so for smell, sound, and taste. The third and final of these three neuron types is the unipolar neuron. Dendrites and axon are continuous, and the body lies off to the side in here. Most sensory neurons of the peripheral nervous system are of the unipolar type. Now we're going to get into the three functional classifications of neurons. The first of those three are the sensory neurons, and there are about 10 million of those, and they form those afferent divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Remember, afferent meaning arriving to the central nervous system, so leaving the peripheral nervous system. They get info from the external and internal sensory receptors, and the receptors are categorized by the information that they detect. There are two types of sensory neurons. So first are the somatic sensory neurons. They give information about the outside world or physical position within it. The external receptors provide information about touch, temperature, pressure, sight, smell, and sound. And proprioceptors monitor the position and movement of skeletal muscles and joints. The second type of sensory neuron are the visceral sensory neurons, and they monitor the activities of the digestive, respiratory, cardiovascular, urinary, and reproductive systems. These provide sensations of taste, deep pressure, and pain. The second of the three functional classifications of neurons are the motor neurons. There are about 500,000 of these, so if you remember, there are significantly fewer of them than your sensory neurons, which there were about 10 million of. So only about 500,000 motor neurons. They form efferent divisions and carry out commands of the central nervous system. So these commands leave the central nervous system and move to the peripheral nervous system so that they can carry out these commands. So you have your somatic motor neurons, which innervate skeletal muscles, and those are the ones that we talked about. And then you have your visceral motor neurons, which innervate all other effectors, so cardiac and smooth muscles, glands, and adipose tissue. The third and final functional classification of neurons are your interneurons, and those you have about 20 billion of. So not 500,000, not 10 million, but 20 billion. These are your association neurons that are entirely within the brain and spinal cord, so they are only within the central nervous system, and they connect other neurons to one another. They distribute the sensory information and coordinate all of your motor activity, and they also play a role in memory, learning, and planning. So that is it for part 2. Those are all of your structural and functional classifications of neurons, and in the final part, part 3, we're going to be talking about the neuroglia.